As Japan's war rolled into 1942, 1/6 of the Earth's surface had been occupied in less than half a year. However, in retaliation to the Pearl Harbor attacks, the first American bombers appeared above Japanese cities. Soon, swarms of opposing aircraft were clashing over the Pacific Ocean, and the Empire's carrier fleet was crippled at Midway. The war had turned for Japan, and they were about to be pushed back toward the home islands. On the 7th of August, 1942, the Americans launched their first major offensive against the Japanese, striking the largest of the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal. Battles raged across air, land, and sea. Allied forces lost over 7,000 men. The Japanese, more than 19,000. By early February 1943, the Empire evacuated its forces from Guadalcanal, and the Japanese War of Conquest was over. The plan now was to hang on to what they had taken. On the afternoon of May 21st, 1943, Tokyo radio announced the death of Admiral Yamamoto, the national hero credited with the success of Pearl Harbor. The announcer said he met a gallant death in a warplane. Yamamoto had famously prophesied a triumphant 6 months of war, followed by uncertainty and possible defeat. By the time of his death, his prophecy had been fulfilled. As Japan's war dragged on, more soldiers were needed to defend the new empire.
First-year recruits remembered that the worst part of the day was in the evening when they got back to the barracks and they were beaten up by the second-year recruits. Soldiers remembered that there was no time to think in between the drills and the parades and then trying to keep themselves neat and organized to avoid the beatings of the older men. The older recruits had gone through the same beatings, and so they made the younger recruits suffer.
By late 1941, the government had mobilized 1 million men and 1 million women between the ages of 16 and 25 for war work. The workforce was augmented by forced labor, Koreans, as many as 500,000, as well as Chinese, Filipino, and Allied prisoners of war. Nearly 140,000 military personnel, captured throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific, were forced to construct Japan's new war amenities. 36,000 were shipped back to the mainland, where they replaced Japanese workers drafted into the armed services. By war's end, more than 30,000 POWs would perish from exhaustion, starvation, or punishment. In December 1943, the Japanese Ministry of Education encouraged those living in metropolitan areas to send their primary school-aged children to live with relatives in the countryside.
1.3 million Japanese children between the ages of 8 and 11 were evacuated to the countryside. And those who were living in schools or at temples or at shrines with their classmates and their teachers then underwent military training. And they're taught to throw grenades, and they're also taught to fight with wooden swords and so forth.
On September 16, 1944, Yamanaka Ryotaro, a schoolteacher in Osaka, accompanied children who were being evacuated to the country. He remained with them for the duration of their exile. His enthusiastic support of the war seems never to have wavered. On the first day of 1945, he wrote, "As my words for the new year, I gave an admonitory lecture saying that we should rise up and greet the year of decisive battles and do what we do with the spirit of the Divine Wind Special Attack Units."
The special attack units are what we call Kamikaze units in the US, but their official name was special attack units.
A father wrote to his son, "Many brave special attack units are racking up impressive battle results. Is this something to be thankful for? I don't know."
The first reason for Japan's resorting to these tactics was that the defense perimeter had been breached. Secondly, the Allies now had new aircraft that were far superior to the Japanese Zero.
Crudely mimeographed leaflets addressed to American officers and men promised that the Japanese Special Attack Corps will sink your vessels to the last destroyer.
The response to this tactic in Japan varied. I've read that the emperor himself is reported to have said, "Do they have to go to such lengths? Do they have to do this?"
"Dear Mother," wrote Hayashi Ichizo the night before his suicide mission, "I just want to be held in your arms and sleep." He was one of an estimated 3,800 kamikaze pilots whose deaths were destructive but not influential. Their sacrifice could not prevent war reaching the homeland. From late 1943, the Allies ground down Japan's outer perimeter, claiming outpost after Pacific outpost. On June 15, 1944, 2 US divisions landed on Saipan in the Marianas.
サイパン島をアメリカ軍が取れば、そこにですね B29 の爆撃機の基地を作って日本本土を空襲することになります。そうなると日本の防空システムは十分じゃないので、もう日本本土がですねもう全部空襲を受けて戦争遂行能力を完全に失ってしまうんですね。
On July 6th, General Sato, commanding the Japanese garrison on Saipan, gave a final order. "I advanced to seek out the enemy," he said. "Follow me." The garrison, including men with bandages, crutches, and men without weapons, charged. When the Americans mopped up, the casualties totaled 29,000 Japanese dead. the Americans lost 3,426.
When the American invasion began, Japanese civilians on Saipan tried to escape the shelling by moving inland. Many tried to commit suicide, others tried to survive. One child, who later became a magistrate in Japan, remembers seeing his mother shot in front of him as he was trying to run across a plain.
On July 10th, General Sato slashed open his stomach and his adjutant shot him in the back of the head.
The US experience on Saipan confirmed the belief of American planners that the Japanese population was not likely to surrender.
When the Japanese lost Saipan, a woman wrote how angry it made her to hear of the soldiers' collective suicide. She thought they should have the courage to give up the fight.
というのは、東条はこのサイパン島こそ日本を守るための防衛ラインの中心なんだっていうことを強調してきました。だから絶対ここは落ちないんだと、陥落しないんだということを国民にですね、豪語してたんですね。ところがこのサイパン島が陥落してしまって、その東条が国民に言ってきたことがですね、
On July 18th, 1944, Hideki Tojo, recognizing what he called a great national crisis, resigned along with his entire cabinet. He would be succeeded by 3 more wartime prime ministers, each distinguished within the military.
だから東条内閣が倒れてしまうっていうのは、次に本土も守れなくなるっていうことを日本側もある程度分かっていたからです。
戦略的に日本は勝つ見込みがなく敗戦しかないということが
The American advance continued toward the Japanese home islands. On the 21st of July, US Marines landed on Guam, before additional landings on Tinian.
So an island hopping campaign where instead of running all your forces up against the Japanese perimeter, you manoeuvred past them, so the isolated Japanese garrisons were left to wither on the line.
Japanese resistance on the islands was quashed in early August. The Commander-in-Chief of Japan's Home Defense Headquarters and final wartime Prime Minister, Prince Higashikumi, knew what defeat in the Marianas meant. Japan itself was now within range of the B-29 bombers. The prince said, "We had nothing in Japan that we could use against such a weapon. We felt that the war was lost." The American B-29 Superfortress was the most expensive weapon of the war yet produced.
It was a huge investment. All the existing bombers didn't have the range to get from nearby bases to Japan back safely, so you needed a very long-range bomb. The B-29 was the way around that problem.
On November 24th, 1944, a bomber force assembled on Saipan. Early in the morning, Brigadier General Emmett O'Donnell led 111 planes in the attack. Over Tokyo, they were met by ineffective anti-aircraft fire and 40 overcautious fighters. The raid did limited damage. Of 1,000 bombs dropped, only 48 fell in the general area of the target.
One of the key problems was that the initial plan was to bomb in the same way they had done in Europe, precision bombing against specific targets to try and undermine the Japanese economy. The problem with that, the aircraft had to operate at a certain level in order to function, and that then created climate conditions with the airstream and so on over Japan, made it very difficult to bomb accurately at high altitude with these aeroplanes.
Further precision bombing raids met with mixed results, and Brigadier General Laurus Norstad, Chief of Staff of the 20th Air Force, called for a switch to area bombing. On January 6, 1945, a new commanding officer was appointed to Bomber Command, General Curtis LeMay. He sent 129 bombers to Kobe. They destroyed 1,000 buildings, damaged 5 munitions factories, and 2 shipyards.
Japanese cities had already been identified as being particularly vulnerable to incendiaries, to firebombs and so on. And so this policy really has devastating effects. The Japanese don't really have any great air defenses they can deploy. Their cities burn really effectively when the incendiaries hit.
Curtis LeMay employed a new strategy, stripping inessentials from the aircraft and loading them with a newly developed weapon: napalm. American scientists found that by adding a thickening agent to fuel, they could create a material that burned longer and tended to stick to surfaces.
Pathfinder aircraft, they fly to the city, they drop their bombs, they light the target up. Then every other bomber flies in streams, and what they were targeting was housing.
You're going to kill an awful lot of civilians, LeMay said. But if you don't destroy Japanese industry, we're going to have to invade Japan. And how many Americans will be killed in an invasion? The opening campaign of 1945 sought victory in the Philippines. The Americans started with Leyte, then moved to the main island of Luzon, where the first landings had occurred at the beginning of January. 14th Corps reached the outskirts of Manila on February 3rd.
ちょっと外国の人は理解できないんじゃないかと思いますけれども、とにかく1945年の頃の日本人はとにかく勝つか全滅するか、それしか選択肢がないという、それが当たり前だというふうに思って戦争してました。
Japanese resistance in Manila did not end until March 3rd, by which time the US 6th Army had taken 6,500 casualties, and the Filipino capital had been reduced to rubble. The Japanese took a terrible toll on the civilian population in a criminal terror as American forces advanced. No less than 100,000 civilians were murdered, and scenes of brutality and rape stained the record of overall commander General Tomoyuki Yamashita. Famed as the Tiger of Malaya, he was later charged with war crimes at a military tribunal.
The Commission finds you guilty as charged and sentences you to death by hanging.
February 19th, advancing American forces landed on an island measuring less than 30 square kilometers, Iwo Jima.
So the idea is if we can capture Iwo Jima, it'll perform two functions. First, the radar station there and any fighters that are stationed there will be eliminated. The second thing is you capture the airfield on Iwo Jima, and it can become what we call a divert airfield for damaged B-29s.
Major General Tadamichi Kurobayashi and 21,000 men had been sent to turn Iwo Jima into an impregnable fortress. They were not expected to return. When the battle ended, Iwo Jima had cost America 6,800 lives. All that remained of the Japanese garrison of 21,000 were 54 prisoners. 2 of them committed suicide. In February 1945, a national radio broadcast called for the gyokusai of the entire Japanese population, the suicide of 100 million.
日本はそれまで一度もその外国勢力から占領されるっていう敗北をされるっていうことがなかったのです。そのために考え方で戦争があれば和平があり、和平があればなんとかまた再建の道があるっていうことを考えなかった。そのために政府はもちろんのこと、日本国民ももう1億玉砕、1億人全部死んでもね、この致し方ないっていうふうな1億玉砕っていうのが合言葉にスローガンになってたぐらいなんですよ。だからその負けるということが、終戦っていうことがなかなか考えつかなかったのですね。まあ考えるのが恐ろしかったというふうに思います。一方の日本はもう負けたらどうなるか分かんないという非常になんていうんですかね、1億日本人が総ヒステリー状態になってたんだろうと思います。その他の考えが及ばなかった。
The engine of Japanese patriotism was fear. When polled after the war, only 4% of the population expected to be treated humanely. As conflict rained down on them, their fears seemed to be confirmed.
People were very upset by the nature of these bombing raids and the fact that so many civilians were killed. That what began to happen as B-29s were shot down is that the crew members were treated as war criminals and killed.
On the evening of March 9th, 1945, 334 superfortresses departed Guam, headed for Tokyo Bay. For 3 hours, wave after wave hit the city. A pilot said, "This blaze will haunt me forever. It's the most terrifying sight in the world." The official Japanese count was published 25 days later. 83,793 killed. Radio Tokyo termed the attack slaughter bombing.
Curtis LeMay wiped out 100,000 people in one night. Is that bombing to destroy the will of the people, or is that extermination warfare? Curtis LeMay will then go on to destroy 60 Japanese cities. 60 Japanese cities.
On March 18th, more than a week after the raid, Emperor Hirohito inspected the damage to his capital. Over 40 square kilometers had been burned down. The death toll made the raid perhaps the most lethal single event of the Second World War. On March 27th, bombers were deployed on a new mission, Operation Starvation, dropping magnetic and acoustic mines into the entrances of Japanese ports and harbors.
"日本の海上交通路はアメリカの飛行機や潜水艦によって完全に切断されてしまいました。そのため日本が戦争するのに必要ないろんな物資や食料は日本国内には入ってこなくなりました。そのため日本の国内では飢餓、飢えが広がっていきました。
Now, the people who may have suffered the most were the evacuated children. In the summer of 1944, when the children were first evacuated with their classmates, the daily ration was 19.9 ounces of raw food. By the summer of 1945, that's been reduced to 14.4 ounces of food.
By March 1945, Japan's air defense force had only 500 serviceable planes to battle America's newly deployed P-51D Mustang. On April 7th, the new fighters escorted 100 superfortresses on a daylight raid over Tokyo. More than 41 square kilometers of the city burned. Officials estimated the death toll at 130,000. The Japanese official history later revised the number to 73,000.
アメリカはですね、その日本について、どれだけの情報を持っていたかということを調べるんですけども、実はアメリカ陸軍はあまり日本のことを知らないんですね。でアメリカ海軍がよく調べてました。で日本の攻撃目標もアメリカ海軍が主に作るんですけれども、その目標はですね、ほとんどなんていうか情報活動で得た目標ではなくて、日本から買った本をこうやって丹念に読んで、そしてこれが大事だということで目標に入れていくわけですけども。
When 520 bombers later hit Tokyo again, their pilots were instructed to avoid the palace. They were told, "The emperor is not at present a liability and may become an asset." A statement which understands the role of the throne in Japanese society and anticipates the post-war accommodation with the emperor. A factory manager exclaimed, "If the enemy could announce a raid beforehand, the enemy was superior." As the bombings persevered, the invasion of the home islands drew closer.
The invasion of Okinawa was one of the precursor operations to the invasion of Japan. The combined chiefs of staff had decided in one of the many strategic conferences, both at Yalta and then at Potsdam, that Okinawa needed to be seized.
The battle for Okinawa was the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War. On April 1st, 1945, 1,300 ships were massed offshore. By nightfall, more than 60,000 Americans had landed. Resistance was slight, casualties few. The defensive line had been set inland. On April 6th, a wave of 600 kamikaze attacked US forces on Okinawa.
The Americans react to the suicide campaign initially with shock because it's so successful, but then they develop these advanced techniques of fighter direction and control.
On the 9th, American forces opened their main offensive against the well-planned fortifications of the Shuri Line.
The Japanese have decided Okinawa is a big island. We're going to withdraw to World War I-style defenses on the interior, and we're going to bleed the Navy with the kamikaze attacks.
By mid-June, the majority of defenders had been killed in action. But the Americans were forced into a long campaign, flushing the remaining Japanese fighters from hiding. US forces finally claimed victory on July 22nd.
6月に沖縄戦が終了して、もう日本としては戦術って取る選択が全くなかったにもかかわらず、その非常に決定が遅かったの。これは非常に残念なことだったと思います。
General Ushijima and his chief of staff had taken their own lives as the battle ended, having, in a witness's words, nobly accomplished their last duty to the emperor. The 82-day campaign on Okinawa had cost the Japanese approximately 110,000 lives, and the Americans over 20,000. Franklin D. Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945. At 7 in the evening, Vice President Harry S. Truman was sworn in as the 33rd President of the United States. Informed by the losses at Okinawa, America projected the casualty rates for the invasion of Japan. The estimate was that taking Kyushu, the first of the home islands, would cause 268,000 American casualties, double the total battlefield deaths suffered by America in the war to date.
When Truman and George C. Marshall get these figures, they realize the invasion of Japan is going to be very, very bloody indeed. They decide, for many reasons, we will continue the strategic bombing of Japan, and then we've got this secret weapon, and maybe we can convince the Japanese with that weapon that they can't win.
When Robert J. Oppenheimer, one of the leading scientists of the Manhattan Project, saw a test blast in the desert of New Mexico, he recalled a verse from a Hindu sacred book. If the light of 1,000 suns were to rise in the sky at once. The president ordered that the bomb be dropped as soon as conditions allowed.
Let's not forget that we are fighting for peace and for the welfare of mankind.
On August 6th, the B-29 Enola Gay released Little Boy over Hiroshima. It detonated 580 meters above the city, generating a blast of 1 million degrees Celsius for 1/10,000th of a second.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold.
The atomic bomb was the ultimate in terms of the blast area weapon, and as had been demonstrated in the war up until that point, area bombing or mass bombing of that nature with 100 or 1,000 bombers could have profound effects. If you could achieve it with one bomb, then you would obviously increase effectiveness, but it would also have a stark and shocking effect if deployed, because it'd be clear that this was a new and different kind of weapon.
"63% of Hiroshima's buildings were destroyed, with total casualties of almost 140,000, from a pre-raid population of 255,000.
Most ordinary Japanese were simply amazed and shocked by the fact that a single bomb could wipe out a city.
Despite the devastation of Hiroshima, there was no response from Japan to the demand for unconditional surrender, so Truman ordered a second attack on Nagasaki. "39,000 were killed, according to the Americans, 74,800, according to authorities in Nagasaki."
「原爆投下はですね、やはり日本の戦争継続派にとっては非常に大きな打撃でした。つまりこのようなものが使われ始めると、日本も、手も足も出ないっていうことが明らかですよね。ですから本土決戦に持ち込めば勝てるっていうふうに思っていた人たちも、とてもその原爆のようなものには対抗できないっていうことが分かっていましたので、まず本土決戦派、戦争継続派にとってその原爆っていうのは非常に大きな打撃であったと。
On April 5th, 1945, a formal Soviet note had advised Tokyo that the Neutrality Pact would not be renewed. It had been of great value to the Soviet Union and little practical use to Japan. Now that the situation was reversed, Stalin wished to seize Manchuria. On the day the bomb fell on Nagasaki, the Red Army invaded. During the campaign, the Soviet Union took 674,000 Japanese prisoners. Only half survived their captivity. When the Supreme Council met in Tokyo on the 9th of August, there was bitter conflict between those arguing for peace and the war party. In a shocking departure from tradition, the Prime Minister approached the Emperor and asked for his views.
当時戦争を終わらせるためには戦争を命じたのも天皇ですから、その天皇の側近たちは今がチャンスだということで天皇に、その戦争終結のですね決断をしてくれということを要求し、天皇もその要求に応えて、その軍部と政府の代表者の前でポツダム宣言を受け入れるしかないんだっていうことを言うわけですね。で
I swallow my tears, said Hirohito, and give my sanction to the proposal to accept the Allied proclamation. On August 14th, leaflets were dropped telling citizens their government has offered to surrender, and every Japanese deserves to know the terms. At noon on August 15th, Japanese all over the empire stood in schools, factories, before loudspeakers in streets and public places. Their heads bowed, they heard their emperor's voice.
Japanese 戦争を終えて、 Saipanを葬り、 金を失い去る者、 Saipan を葬り、 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 金を失い去る者、 Saipan
これはラジオ放送を通じて天皇が国民に直接訴えるっていうことは初めてだったんです。それまでラジオには天皇の声は流しちゃいけなかったんですね。それでもですね、やっぱりその天皇が直接国民に語りかけたっていうことは非常に当時の日本人にとっては衝撃的な事実で。
The Emperor said, after pondering deeply the general trends of the world and the actual conditions obtaining in our empire today, we have ordered our government to communicate to the governments of the United States, Great Britain, China, and the Soviet Union that our empire accepts the provisions of their joint declaration.
I think most people felt relief that they were at the ends of their ropes physically, psychologically, and they realized that the surrender would mean that they would survive. A second response was genuine fear and concern about what would happen now that the war had ended.
On the 21st of August, Prince Higashikuni Naruhiko, Japan's final wartime prime minister, called a meeting to discuss an important issue. According to a Japanese military plan devised in July 1941, in anticipation of their army occupying foreign territory, it was estimated that 20,000 women would be required to meet the sexual needs of every 700,000 Japanese soldiers, one woman for every 35 men. To these enslaved and abused women from Korea, Taiwan, and other areas is attached the obscene label, comfort women. They are estimated to have numbered between 80 and 100,000.
When we focus on the brutality of Japanese troops, we often think of Allied POWs because they were the ones who were able to leave memoirs behind. Amongst those, we might also think of the women who were recruited into military brothels and who often were not able to document their experiences.
There was concern that the army shortly to conquer and occupy Japan would be no different from any other. Provisions should be made for its sexual appetites as a way of reducing the incidence of rape. The Recreation and Amusement Association was established, and a special government fund of 30 million yen allocated to the project. Governors and police chiefs of all prefectures were instructed to procure women from geisha houses, brothels, and nightclubs to staff a nationwide organization for the exclusive use of the anticipated army of occupation. At its peak, more than 70,000 women worked for the organization. It did not prevent sexual violence. The first reported case of rape was on August 30th. 2 US Marines went into a civilian house in Yokosuka and raped a mother and daughter at gunpoint. The Marines had been in Japan for just 3.5 hours. Two days earlier, Colonel Charles Tench stepped from a transport plane, the first conqueror to set foot on Japanese soil. On September 2nd, 1945, General Douglas MacArthur called forward General Wainwright, who had surrendered his command in the Philippines, and General Percival, who had surrendered his command in Singapore. They stood at his shoulder on the deck of the USS Missouri at anchor in Tokyo Bay, as he accepted Imperial Japan's unconditional surrender.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored.
The ceremony lasted for 23 minutes. The American occupation lasted 7 years. But Japan could not be reshaped until the trials of those accused of war crimes were concluded.
東京裁判は戦後のアメリカにとってパートナーになれない人物を全部有罪にして戦後の世界から排除したんですね。だから天皇は一緒にやっていける人物なので、そもそも起訴もされなかった。ところが東条たちはこれはもう絶対役に立たない人たちなので結局処刑されてしまう。ですからマッカーサーとしては天皇を戦犯にするんじゃなくて、協力者として、やはり扱ったんですね。ですからそのためには戦争をやったのは軍人たちであって天皇は直接関係なかったんだっていうことを盛んに宣伝するんです。で多くの日本人もそう思いたかったっていうか天皇には責任がないんだっていうふうに思いたかったこともあって結局天皇は戦争に直接関与しなかったんだっていう神話がそこで作られてしまうんですね。
The main goals for the Allied occupation of Japan were demilitarization and democratization of Japan, so that Japan would never be a threat. And it was carried out almost entirely by the United States. To realize these goals, they dismantled the military, got rid of oppressive laws, implemented a political purge, and created a new constitution.
I can't really think of other historical examples where you've seen such a dramatic social and cultural transformation.
As life inside Japan found a new normal, its empire spanning the Pacific was dismantled. It's been estimated that 83,000 civilians were killed during the occupation of Malaya. Approximately 164,000 perished in war crime events in the Philippines. 4 million died in the Dutch East Indies as a result of famine and forced labor. The number of Chinese civilian deaths is unknown, but might be more than 50 million. Japanese victories over the old imperial powers, Britain, France, the Netherlands, meant that their former territories would never go back to accepting European rule. In every case, there was to be bloodshed, but finally, there was independence for Malaya and Singapore, for Burma, for the Indian subcontinent, Indochina, and Indonesia. Japan's war reshaped the world. In China, the Japanese withdrawal triggered a civil war. For Vietnam, peace took decades. For Korea, the legacy of Japan's occupation continues today. Japan's war transformed the nation at a cost of 3 million Japanese dead from war-related causes. But truth can be an uncomfortable companion, no less for Japan than anywhere else. In the 21st century, the country still struggles to come to terms with some of the stories that took place inside Japan's war.